We've been talking a lot about Bordeaux recently,
Hmm.
and it just made me recall about this one really nervous French winemaker from Bordeaux. It turns out he was afraid of his own chateau.
Hello, and welcome to the Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot button topics in the wine world. I am your host, Catherine Cole, joined by co-host Martin Reyes, MW.
So for this episode, Catherine, we will be joined by Eric Asimov, the longtime New York Times wine columnist and author, and wine critic Jean Bonnet, who is a managing editor at Resi.
That's correct, and we are going to discuss wine criticism in this episode. And Martin, I know that you actually wrote your Master of Wine dissertation on this topic, so I think you know a lot about it.
Interesting coincidence. Yes, I did. It was called the Rise of the Consumer Critic. And I was exploring the roles
Hmm.
of crowdsourced ratings, like Amazon rates toasters and Vivino and other places do 5 stars for wine. Does that move the needle in a retail environment? If a person comes in and they see 4.4 stars out of 5 from 500 people versus a 95 points from, a recognizable magazine critic.
And it's so interesting because I think one of the things we'll talk about is that wine criticism is sort of dying and it is being replaced. I mean, it seems like that topic was very timely and prescient for that matter. When did you write that dissertation?
Oh, that was back in 2017. And I think one of the things that came out of that was really that some people will simply not, and I think we allude to this in the episode, some people, their relationship with wine is very superficial and it's never going to change. And so the role of a numeric system serves a purpose, even if it's an incomplete one. And I know that there's a lot more, there's a whole world. We know there's a whole world beyond just the score. But sometimes if you've got nothing left to, you don't have much time to do much of else, you go from one to the other. And that's an easier choice to make at times, as unfortunate as it is for those of us who want to be more thoughtful about our wine consumption.
Yeah, I think we all as humans like things to be reduced to stars and numbers and scores. And it's funny, I have personal experience as well. I'm coming at this topic having been the wine columnist for a newspaper, The Oregonian, for 13 years. And during that time, I always called myself a columnist. I never called myself a critic. I
Mm.
was horrified by the idea of assigning a numerical score to someone's life work. You know, people put their heart and soul into this work, and often it can be heartbreaking, if there's a terrible vintage. And I just didn't think it was my place to ever assign a numerical score to a wine. But I'm interested to hear from our two guests who are both longtime critics who have somehow managed to play that critical role without being a score giver. And I just always have admired both of their writing, Eric's and John's. So I'm super excited to hear what they have to say.
Yeah, me too. And Catherine, you bring much needed soul to that transaction because I have to remind myself that yes, at times if I'm judging on a decanter panel in London or something like that, and you taste a wine for a few seconds, you spit it out, and as one does when they're tasting hundreds of wines a day, you can't consume it, and you give a numerical
Hmm.
score, maybe a couple of notes that you jot down, and you move on very quickly,
Oh, yeah.
and then that moment, that entire life's work is almost like it's in an audition where it has only one shot, and if it doesn't make it, that score is conferred at a lower level, and it has potentially not as positive consequences as it could otherwise. And I don't think too much about the story behind that. I just give it a score and move on.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, we should do another episode on wine competitions because that's so true. But it is the way that many critics score as well. Because I've sat with critics from major publications while they've tasted, and you're right. It's just like a wine competition. And now, folks, if you're listening and don't know what we're talking about going through flights of 12 glasses of wine at a time. Easily tasting 60 wines by lunchtime,
Hmm.
and then by the time it's
Not
3
easily, but
p.m.
yeah.
by the time it's 3 p.m. or 4 p.m., your palate is dead and you're told to
Hmm.
assign a score to this wine. And yeah, it happens in a matter of seconds. So another thing that I won't talk about in this discussion, but having been a wine columnist for a minor newspaper, Eric and John were two of the only people in the country who were really paid full-time wages to write about wine. And the rest of us have day jobs and somehow make it work. And so we don't wield quite the power that major wine critics do, or I didn't as a wine journalism contractor for the Oregonian. So I think there is a difference between critics who do this full time and critics who are just kind of trying to squeeze it in. At any rate, I digress. I'm excited to hear this episode.
I am too. Let's jump into it.
When most of us think of a wine critic, we're actually imagining one of two species: the magazine critic, think Wine Spectator, or the critic who writes for a subscription website or newsletter such as Wine Advocate. We are joined for this episode by Eric Asimov, wine critic for the New York Times, and John Bonet, former wine critic at the San Francisco Chronicle. These journalists both hail from a different lineage. They're in newspapers, not newsletters or magazines, and I think that's an important distinction. So let's start our conversation there. Eric, maybe you could start us off by just defining the term wine critic as it means to you.
Yeah. Hi, Catherine. At the Times, the term critic has a very specific meaning. It's somebody who offers opinionated evaluations of cultural expressions. So that's really it for me. I'm talking about wine, but I'm offering opinions that I hope are supported in the arguments that I make. It may take the form of evaluating particular bottles or particular styles or producers or vintages, or it may just be talking about larger issues in wine.
So, in what way do you think you approach it differently as a newspaper critic than, say, a magazine critic or a subscription website critic would?
Well, the readership for a publication like the Times is general. You assume that people who are buying Wine Spectator or Wine Advocate are particularly interested in wine and have a certain degree of knowledge before they decide to pick up that publication. But the Times has a huge readership, many of whom know nothing about wine. And my particular readers may run the spectrum from novices who are just wondering what sort of bottle to pick up on their way home to dinner, to experts in particular fields, collectors who know far more than I do about that narrow specialty.
Mm-hmm.
So, Catherine, I think it's interesting that you started with this taxonomy of the wine critic and three buckets. And as you point out, Eric and me, back when I used to wear a newspaper hat, fit into one. And at the Chronicle, the definition was largely the same, that it was very much about seeing the broader cultural implications of wine and not simply sticking Post-its with numbers onto things, although there was certainly a degree of that. But the other two categories you described, like magazines, I mean, there was a time there would have been a general magazine critic for wine that has unfortunately largely passed. Newsletter, I mean, essentially, this is sort of the Wine Advocate and its many, many offspring over the years. And both of those largely exist in the framework of doing volumes of scores.
Mm-hmm.
With commentary, with lots of other things, but it's ultimately sort of putting numbers on things and very much sort of a programmatic approach to criticism versus Eric and I had what I used to call the unicorn jobs, which was to be able to see things much more holistically.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when I started moving into writing books and thinking about, well, how do you write a book that's not just a pure reference book, and how do you actually bring a perspective? And I realized something that had come up a few times when I was talking with California winemakers, which is that, to Eric's point, it really is about not just seeing the individual bottle in front of you, but seeing the culture and understanding the context and seeing what this brings that makes it more important than a can of White Claw. Something I ask myself, I'm curious if any of you have been in the same place, is, has something gotten lost in translation where whatever the cultural value of wine has been just isn't processing anymore?
Well, John, I think that we're rediscovering the cultural value of wine. I think it's been lost for a long time when you had dominant critics like Parker and The Spectator who were just piling on the scores and the tasting notes. And the wine really got divorced from the people who produced it and the place it came from. There was a whole school of thought, and there still is, that all that matters is what's in the glass. In other words, just tasting the wine and tasting it blind and giving it a score and a tasting note is all you need to understand. And in fact, it's a superior way of looking at wine, because then you're not afraid of being biased by what you could know. It's in some ways it's kind of an anti-intellectual way of looking at wine. I think we're coming out of that now, because I think those critics are not holding sway anymore. And while scores are still important to the business, there are a lot more voices talking about more than simply what it tastes like in a glass.
I want to play a devil's advocate for a minute, but first I want to make the caveat that the newspaper critic, at the very core, it is about sharing stories and the culture, as you referenced. Whereas, as you mentioned, pro critics share judgment before the story. But at the same time, there's some consumer out there that simply views wine, unfortunately, and I know that Eric's written about this extensively, as a commodity, as a simple pleasure, and they want to differentiate between one wine versus the other, not really thinking much about it. And to that degree, for that audience, there's still a futility to something as simplistic as a score, and that I think can coexist with as a small subset of what both John and Eric are doing, which is the broader sharing of the culture, the stories, and the education that even wine professionals read both of your articles and your books, and we learn something new every day as well.
I think there's a perceived utility. In other words, a consumer imagines that by having a score, he or she can then differentiate from among the wines. But it's really kind of a false perception. And I think that scores don't really convey the information that a lot of consumers think that it does. But there's the appearance of ease. It makes the decision-making process easier and simpler. That's a kind of a practical utility, but also a false impression, since it doesn't really tell you maybe what you need to know about the wine.
But wait, there's something that we haven't addressed here yet, and I'm really curious to hear all of your thoughts. And that is, I think that consumers really have no idea whether wine criticism is subjective or objective. And sometimes these scores are presented in such a way that they are objective statements, like this wine is 95 points good. And so people just take it at face value. And in some ways, I feel like, it's a little bit false advertising to be presenting these scores in this way. So John and Eric, from both of you, I'd like to hear how much of criticism is subjective and how much of it is objective to you.
Well, I find it interesting that that what we don't have on today is a representative from a certain magazine that shall not be named to harangue us for not believing in the absolute pure power of objectivity and chastising us for our strange hippie views about the story and the gestalt. I mean, I've gotten into fights with people, particularly from that publication, about this bizarre notion of objectivity. And I do find it ironic that it's the two newspaper guys who theoretically work in a profession that, preaches objectivity, which it doesn't really, but that's a long path. But I mean, look, definitionally, there is no objectivity in criticism. It is impressionistic, and it doesn't really matter what you apply to it. And even if you take it outside of the distinctive cultural realm, if you're writing about, let's say, the Australian Open, you can look at the numbers and you can see who won or lost, but that doesn't actually provide the tone and the hue of what happened. What's more complicated is we were talking about sort of the capital T, capital C, the consumer. The consumer is for sure shifting. And I think if in the 80s and 90s there was a consumer who was somewhat interested in scores, either as sort of a horse race or because they just literally didn't have any other guideposts, then I would argue, to Eric's point, like if you started asking the wine drinking members of Gen Z, as it were, where their guidance is coming from, I would say they're definitely not coming from scores. I don't know if they're coming from their, deep reading of Dead Tree media.
Whether it's shifted or not, in the past 40 years, wine critics have historically been a source of power. Their opinion is there's a megaphone there. So sometimes a good or a bad review can make or break a business. So my question to you is, what responsibility does a wine critic have? And I'm thinking like Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility.
It's a deep, multi-layered question. But my question, actually, probably for Eric more than anyone, because I'm thinking about it, is I think I can say with some certainty that a wine critic can, or in the past has been able to, make a business. I'm not convinced that a critic can break a business. I think it's a stretch to make that argument even with restaurants. And I think certainly with wine, I struggle to think of a time that a critic has just destroyed a business. I think they've caused some pain. But even sort of the most pointed example of Robert Parker going after Tim Mondavi in, I think it was 2000 for the 98 vintage, and just, just blasting him. Like, this did not in any way destroy the Robert Mondavi winery. It just forced them to change some of their thoughts about business.
Yeah, John, I would agree with that. There's this story of the butcher of Broadway who could kill a show with a bad review. And, that probably still is possible, but not in wine. You can pique people's interest in a wine that they've never heard of. So you can help people. But to answer Martine's question, I think our responsibility is always, and without question, to the reader. We owe it to the wine industry to be fair and conscientious, and to double check ourselves if we're going to be critical. But ultimately, we owe honesty to the reader. And if that involves hurting people's feelings or, in their opinion, needlessly criticizing their product, so be it.
I do like what you said earlier in a piece you wrote, Eric. I quote you: "A critic's job is not to validate the choices of the consumer. If anything, is to make them question their assumptions." And later on, you use the word guide. Like, you think of yourself as a guide, which I think is an incredibly useful analogy. If you think of a tour guide in a city, I like that. Objectively, aesthetics matter. The story of that castle matters, but that tour might mean something different to a teenager than to a senior citizen. Right. So I like that, because then we can sort of develop how some of the tourists will follow his lead, her lead, and sometimes a tour guide has a bias. They bend the script that's been given to them to their own experience, having walking those streets so much. So being a guide, I think, is an incredibly useful analogy.
The world of wine is so complicated, and that's one explanation for the utility of scores, as you said. But we need people who can make sense out of wine for people who don't have the hours that we devote to the subject. And if that's means calling attention to new areas that they might want to consider, to new grapes, to new producers, because as John has said, and I believe, we live in the greatest time in history if you love wine. The diversity that is available to us is also overwhelming. And we have to spend time making sense out of this. And to me, that's a far more important function than just rating individual bottles year after year. It's a good business model for a wine critic because it creates dependency on you if your way of thinking is that wine is totally random and every bottle one year to the next can be great or awful, but it's not really service to the consumer.
Can I jump in? So I love what you're saying, and you are saying that you do need to be something of a curator. And something that's just really intrigued me these past few years is the notion of the critic as an activist and pushing for change in the industry, pushing for higher standards, pushing for more sustainability, better human rights records in the vineyard. What do you all think of that? I mean, I think that critics, they do have this great power, and that power could be wielded for good. I mean,
You asked that question last season, Catherine,
I did.
right? We did. What was it? Was like if all major critics agree to what was it that you said?
To limit their reviews to wineries that uphold a certain sustainability and human rights standard. Because I see, and I may be thinking of the same publication that John mentioned earlier, I see very well funded wine publications glorifying these wineries that are clearly on the record as having committed these environmental atrocities. And it just seems to me, if you have this power, why not use it for good? What do you all think of that idea?
I've come to believe that more and more, Catherine, and I agree with you. I've taken a lot of shit from readers. At some point in 2021, I wrote an article about what makes a wine great. And I raised the question of whether a wine can be great if the producer is completely unconcerned with issues of social justice and environmental responsibility. And I said I didn't think so. And I got a lot of pushback, but I believe that. I think those are crucial issues in our time. And it's not really debatable, climate change and environmental responsibility. People can try to debate it and try to both sides it, but you can't. It's happening, and you have to take the necessary steps. If you refuse to do that, it's not that I won't write about somebody, but I take that into account in looking at the wine, and I think it makes a difference in the quality of the wine.
Not to invoke the language of neoconservatives, but I think that it is something that you have to handle delicately, which is to say, I don't know that I would want to have a checklist that I would go down to make sure that I was being the values police and confirming that X and Y was done environmentally. And, I checked all the labor laws. I mean, A, because at some point it becomes just impossible to do. But B, I think so much more about understanding, did something bad happen? Did the winery acknowledge it? Was there improvement? What is sort of the operating philosophy? There are plenty of people out there who you could sort of point to who got the biodynamic thing down, but they're also kind of right-wing crypto fascists. There's no shortage of this in
Oh
France.
yeah, yeah.
To Eric's point, you have to look at this somewhat holistically, and you have to see that there are shades of gray. There are things that, if someone is like, well, screw it, I'm just going to tear this cliffside down, that is a problem, and it needs to be addressed in some way. And frankly, I think and I've definitely written this, that it's completely fine to simply decide that you are going to write certain wineries or winemakers out of history, if you will, because their behavior is questionable enough. You do have a responsibility to try and understand it and significantly question whether this is just you drawing a line and saying, this is not culturally something that we want to endorse.
Mm-hmm.
I think environmentally, though, it's a little bit different. I mean, we are talking about agricultural products, and we are talking about quality, and I think that there are certain methods that contribute to making better wine, but you can't judge it solely in terms of what they're doing, because we're not the final authority on what methods are best environmentally. I mean, there are certain sort of gross procedures that we know are bad, but There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of room for debate, and nobody has to meet my standards to expect fair valuation.
And Catherine, it's interesting. So, having spent quite a lot of time, the better part of the last decade, running around to little corners of France, it's fascinating because in France there is really no barrier between the political and wine. It is by definition political. It is a core part of their tradition, and some of it is that wine there comes with its own politics because it is literally government regulated, not the way it is here, but like, the government controls appellations, the government controls whether you get to get your tax stamp or not. It's a very politically intrusive system. But there also are ways in which it is literally politically charged. And you go to somewhere like, say, the Languedoc, and you see for 100 years that they have essentially been leaning on the politics of populism to justify making crappy, cheap wine. And even today, you see that there is still this belief that somehow the government, the French government, like owes them a living in a very socialist way because they are the farmers and they are doing farmers' work. You are not a vigneron in France without sort of finding your place in the spectrum of politics.
When people ask me what Oregon wines I'm excited about right now, I always say traditional method sparkling wines. That is, bottle fermented wines made in the Champenoise style. And, one of my favorite producers is Lytle Barnett. And luckily enough for us, they are our generous sponsor for this episode of The Foretop. Lytle Barnett produces vintage-driven sparkling wines that really speak of the Eola Amity Hills appellation. And Rachel and I are here, and we are going to taste through some delicious Lytle Barnett bubblies today. So let's start out with the 2017 Blanc de Blanc. This wine was just disgorged, so it's hot off the presses. It's just so frothy and bright and yummy. There's lots of citrus. It really cleans my mouth out. This is the kind of wine you want to start your meal off with. But Rachel, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think this wine is super refreshing. I get Meyer lemon on the nose. There's some delicious minerality on the palate, so it just gives it that kind of like clean, fresh feel. And then it has all those just lovely, wonderful, exuberant bubbles.
Well, folks, you need to try these wines for yourself. They are just delicious. So go to lytlebarnett.com to learn more about Lytle Barnett sparkling wines. That's lytle-barnett.com. That's Lytle Barnett. Thank you so much, Lytle Barnett, for sponsoring this episode. We really enjoy your wines. This episode of The Foretop is brought to you by Aubaine. Aubaine is French for windfall, and this refers to the serendipity around the Aubaine winemaking project, as well as to the strong winds off the Pacific that blow down the Van Duzer corridor and into the Eola Amity Hills in Oregon's Willamette Valley. These Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays are sourced from 2 estate vineyards in the Eola Amity Hills appellation, which I'm sorry, I just have to say this. It's my favorite appellation in the Willamette Valley. Those 2 vineyards are Anahata and the appropriately named Windfall Vineyard. The owner is Andy Lytle, whom we know at the Foretop from Lytle Barnett Sparkling Wines, and the winemaker is the extremely talented Isabelle Meunier. So let's dig into the 2019 Anahata Vineyard Estate Chardonnay from the Eola Amity Hills. Let's take a taste of this wine from Aubaine. This Chardonnay went through a spontaneous fermentation. It's so smooth. It's from a cool and slightly challenging vintage, which is something I always love, the 2019. And holy wow, I love this wine. It's fresh, it's smooth, it's spicy. I'm getting notes of vanilla bean. Rachel, what do you think about this Chardonnay?
I think it's wonderful. I get this like slightly underripe white peach to it, really nice minerality, and then it has this beautiful long finish to it. Just yum.
Yeah, I love that juicy acidity at the finish. Folks, you have got to try this Chardonnay. It's absolutely delicious. You can learn more about Aubaine wines at aubainewine.com, and I will spell that for you. AUBAINE wine.com. Thank you, Aubaine, for sponsoring the Foretop. We're loving this wine, and we really love working with you. Thanks. Well, I want to transition a little bit here, drawing from the previous conversation, because as we all have been sort of hand wringing and pearl clutching about the fact that wine drinkers are aging, we have fewer millennials and even fewer Gen Z wine drinkers out there. It may be because there isn't enough accountability. I'm not sure, but one thing that is for sure is I am not seeing young, fresh faces in wine criticism. I certainly am not seeing a lot of women. There are a few. Definitely not people of color and younger folks. So, Martine, where are the young wine critics?
Well, that's a fascinating question because I think who constitutes a critic
Mhm.
itself is also changing. We've got a lot more channels of media. Frankly, we have a lot more information and probably information overload. You look at your phone, your computer, your laptop, your movies, and so forth. There's a lot there, and I think that they are there. If you think of if you define critic in a more general way of people who have a following, whether that is social media or otherwise. It's certainly more fragmented, but I think they are there, and we also can ask ourselves, well, why do classically viewed wine critics tend to be older and white or male? And that answer is kind of self-evident too. We can discuss the social and cultural machinations of how wine has been most of the modern era, but those who are coming out, I think that whether they are younger, whether they're male or female, whether there's more diversity as well. There's a reaction to see how things have been done in the past. How do these young critics who've came up exposed to wine and traditional gatekeepers of knowledge, how they feel and how they react to it, and then therefore how they turn around and start to develop their own thoughts.
Well, Martine, I would say that, there are only three full-time newspaper wine critics that I'm aware of in the United States, and two of them are women, Esther Mobley and Letty Teague.
Mhm.
Not that the number is so small, so not very meaningful, but that's part of the problem. There are no paying wine critic jobs available for the most part. I'm very privileged to have one of them, but we're aging, and eventually will be replaced. No doubt they will be younger people. They may be people of color, but as Martine said, younger people are not really looking to institutional critics. They're looking to their friends. They're crowdsourcing. I think that's where it's going because there simply aren't any paying jobs, which is a problem in and of itself because so-called influencers are often paid by the people that they're supposed to be offering opinions about. And we get back to the very rationale for having independent critics in the first place, people who can be watchdogs rather than lackeys.
Incidentally, of course, the question being posed to the middle-aged white guys, but
Gotcha.
I thought about that as I asked it. Yeah.
there's this question I often ask to Eric's point, which is, does the industry, having finally gotten rid of Parker, prefer the system that exists now in which it is sort of all influencers and TikTok and crowdsourcing and buzz and sort of moving away from the faux objectivity, but sort of direct market influence? Or frankly, like, was it easier when someone would give you 91 points that you could stick on the shelf at Total Wine?
Mhm.
And that was, you didn't need a marketing budget. That was your marketing budget was making sure that the bottle got into the right hands and you greased things as they needed to be done. And then you'd move your bottles. And my inclination has been to think that the industry actually doesn't, they kind of prefer the state of evolving chaos that exists right now, only in that there is 1,000 small points of opportunity versus having to pray to the same three idols. But that said, it's not as though out of all of this that some glorious growth in the interest of wine has risen up. There is this kind of ambient sense of crisis of whether there's going to be a new generation of wine drinkers, whether things have moved on. My maybe Pollyannish view is that like this will all sort out, and when Gen Z has more disposable income, then wine tends to, become more relevant. When you actually have a house, which means you can have dinner parties at your house, then you start thinking about what you're going to do. I mean,
And you have a place to store your wine. I mean,
you have a place to store your wine. Yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, I sort of wonder, like, are there going to be voices that rise up out of this? It will almost certainly not be at the places where it is now, except maybe the New York Times, which I will keep my fingers crossed will like always maintain this beat, which I grew up reading is so vital, and as Eric has said many times, like the fact that he has the role as chief wine critic and that it is aligned with the other chief critics at the paper is a very strong statement in the cultural value of wine. I don't tend to like to believe that like it's just all going to be wine influencers 5 years from now, but I also literally have no sense of what the path is to that new voice.
Can I ask you all, with this fragmentation of criticism or commentary or whatever it is, does this mark kind of the end of the icon wine? I mean, when I think of the traditional points critics, I think of a giant cab or a giant red Rhone that gets 99 points and it's, just bludgeons you with its tannins. And I feel like the point system kind of went along with that style of wine. And which one came first, the chicken or the egg? I'm not even sure. But what do y'all think? Do you think
May I answer that?
Yes, please do.
In a word, no, it doesn't mean the end. And the reason is not because of points, it's because of money. People with lots of money, and certainly there's been a growing wealth disparity for 40 years in this country, want rare wines. They want objects of desire, and they're going to spend whatever it takes. And whether you call them Colt Cabernets or Grand Cru Burgundy, the gaze of desire is always going to turn in another direction, but it's always going to be there. For Gen Z, I mean, this is all part of the same issue. Why are younger people drinking less wine? Because they have a greater appreciation aesthetically of wine, and so won't spend their money on cheap, shitty wine. But really good wine is so much more expensive than really good beer or good spirits. So I think that's part of the same problem. And ultimately, you can never divorce wine from the rest of society, whether you're talking about climate change or wealth disparity.
I sort of want to flip the score question on its head, in that what's happening now that's interesting, and it's been several years, but especially sort of the past year or so in French wine magazines, and this is like RVF, and I'm always curious about what's going on there, because on one hand, they are sort of like the biggest followers of the worst trends of American wine critics. On the other hand, it's been interesting that, now that sort of Parker's gone and, a lot of the old North Stars are no longer there, that, there's more variability, there's more independence, even in, say, like Decanter in the UK, you see it. But it's been fascinating to see some of the like 97, 98, 99 point scores that are coming out of RBS, which is the Revue de Vin de France, which, is for things like Muscadet. When they do Bordeaux, it's not necessarily only the Lafitte's and the Petruses that are getting these scores. It's these smaller or independent estates, like Gombaud Guillot in Pomerol, which for years they were kind of like the weird farmer hippies down the road. And suddenly they're getting these extraordinary points in sort of the official conservative bastion of French wine reviewing. I think there certainly is movement in terms of like, even in the old system, you can now give these scores to wines that are very postmodern and feel of the moment. But back to our sort of larger question, like, I'm not sure that makes a difference in actually persuading the people who will very soon have the economic power over the industry.
This is upsetting me for a couple of reasons. One of which is no one's supposed to know how good Muscadet is. It's supposed to be our secret, right? That's one wine we can afford.
Secret's out. Sorry.
Oh no! I hope the price doesn't go up.
There are no secrets among a group of journalists.
Well, listen, folks, we unfortunately have come to the end of our time, and now it is time to move on to the dessert wine course, where we each share something we have been enjoying this week. And I will just jump in and say this topic caused me to go back and revisit some Pauline Kael. She was the greatest film critic ever. And she was an activist critic. If you're interested in film, go check her work out. She pushed for more realism and a more feminist perspective in film. Amazing critic. And contemporary critics in the food realm, whom I really admire, and we've had on the Foretop, Soleil Ho and Khushbu Shah. Soleil's at the San Francisco Chronicle. Khushbu Shah is at Food and Wine. And they both have been pushing for more inclusion and a more sort of world-minded approach to dining, to food writing, food criticism, and I love their work as well. So I loved having this topic to kind of take some time and revisit some of my favorite writers. Who else has a little dessert wine course to share?
Well, I have two. First, I'll continue from what John was just saying and talk about Bordeaux. Bordeaux has been so unfashionable among not only younger people, but people who were sort of anti-score, or people who had discovered Burgundy and thought of Bordeaux as the antithesis of the honest vigneron, the person who grows grapes and makes the wine, the marketer versus the farmer. And I understand that a lot of Bordeaux is owned by multinational corporations, and when you go there, you're passed off to the guy in the Hermes tie, and it can seem like a very kind of artificial environment. But there is a community of Bordeaux vignerons. And for me, I have been recently enjoying so many interesting Bordeaux, and it's really I won't say I ever lost my love for Bordeaux, but it sort of gets consigned to a far off area from time to time. But recently, I've just been drinking some wonderful wines from small producers that I've really enjoyed. The other thing I would recommend, if you're interested in the kind of nexus between wine and food and culture and tradition, the Chief Bruno mystery stories of Martin Walker, all set in the Perigord.
Yeah,
and it's about a police chief in one small town, the only police officer in that town, and you have your standard mysteries that need to be solved, but much more of it is a debate about the clash between globalization and local traditions and the importance of maintaining them. There's a lot of discussion about food and wine, and I just find it very appetizing in a lot of ways and intriguing.
love those books. Thank you.
I'm not going to say Eric stole my thunder, but he stole a bit of my thunder, which is fine. I have been proofing the last couple chapters of my next book, which is The New French Wine, and those are on Bordeaux and the Southwest. And so it has, in fact, been inspiring me to go back and drink a lot of Bordeaux. It's also, it's just, there is so much joy. Those are honestly chapters I thought I was going to hate writing, like hate reporting, hate writing. And they ended up to be so fascinating because there is not a ton of vitality in Bordeaux, but increasingly you're seeing that there is the beauty of the small. And then as you move farther out into the Southwest, I again, sort of thought that I wouldn't be interested, but it's made me go back and discover some of the things that I truly enjoyed along the way, not the least of which is the new generation in Cahors, which is not a place that in a million years I thought I would be endorsing. I wrote one of the nastiest columns that I have ever written about Cahors back in like 2010. And so I somehow have come sort of 360, but it's fascinating. There, there is this reclamation of an older artisan tradition of realizing that, Malbec is not the entire story there. There's this full range of grapes, and really sort of the incubation of so much of French wine took place in regions in the Southwest and in places like Cahors and Gaillac, up in Limoux. And so I've just been getting deeper into it. And just to throw a lagniappe on, since my Bordeaux idea clearly is shared, I bizarrely have been going back and rereading A.J. Liebling, specifically between meals.
Not bizarrely, it's a great book.
Yeah.
One, just because, I don't know, I like Paris is always on the brain. And two, in the midst of so much, I think, sort of overdue reflection in terms of the food writing world and the food media world, I candidly just I wanted to read something totally sybaritic and indulgent. And so I just had to go there.
Good stuff. Thank you.
John, while I have you in a Southwest mood, I just drank a beautiful wine made with a grape I never heard of before, Fair Cervadu.
Yeah. Fair.
Again,
I've become, when I used to taste Marciac, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, I was like, this is horrible.
Aveyron.
Aveyron is, this, we'll have to take this whole conversation offline. Aveyron is the great hope. Fair, I have become the biggest champion of Fair. It's extraordinary. And I'm so deeply in love with it.
My dessert course, I came back from San Diego recently. That's where I'm from. And, there's a couple that own this shop, this pizza place called it's called The Shop, actually. And The Shop Pizza and Cocktails. I think it's in Rancho Bernardo. If anyone makes it down to San Diego, they have some of the best pizza. It's deep dish inspired, but they have a traditional crust called the Happy Cow. And it's mushrooms, tomatoes, red onions, basil, I think ricotta, and it's a white sauce based, and it's among the best pizzas I've ever had. There's rumors that if you add sausage to it, it's called now a sad cow, which is what I've heard them say. So it's not actually a joke. It's real. I promise you, this is what they say. I'm not just trying to be a punster.
Duly noted. Thank you, Martin. Well, thank you so much to our brilliant panelists.
Yes, and you can find wine author and Resi managing editor John Bonnet online at johnbonnet.com. That's John, JONBONNE.com.
And Eric Asimov's New York Times columns, of course, are online at nytimes.com.
Alas, you can find me, Martin Reyes, at reyeswinegroup.com, and this is certifiedsustainable.wine. That's something fun.
That's exciting. And you can find me, Catherine Cole, at catherinecole.com, or even better, over at thefourtop.org.
This has been the Four Top Podcast. Catherine Cole is our executive producer, Izzy Kramer is our senior producer, and I'm Keelan King, sound supervisor. We are also assisted by audio editor, Michelle Richards, our production assistant, Rachel Grossman, creative assistant, Lex Rule, and editorial assistant, Nick Toole. Please visit our website, thefourtop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, reach out to us on social media, and purchase books written by our amazing panelists. And if you have not already subscribed to The Four Top on iTunes or Spotify, please do so and leave us a rating. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.